Okay, our next talk is from Haixin.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. This is such a great conference. I learned a lot. So today I'm here to talk to you about social epistemology and science communication. So scientists are currently reimagining what academic publications can and ought to look like in the 21st century. And here I have on this slide just a smattering of the, different kinds of initiatives and platforms that are emerging. Academic publishing is currently on the precipice of a real revolution. The internet and new digital technologies have kind of enabled different ways of scientists to communicate their research. For example, the journal eLife recently have said that it would publish every single paper that is sent to it for peer review, and authors would never again receive a rejection after a negative review. Instead, reviewers' reports would be published alongside the paper together with a short editorial assessment of the work's significance and rigor. And then authors could then decide whether to revise their paper to address any comments. So this is like a kind of a radically different way of doing papers. PubPeer is a open source kind of big platform in which people can engage in crowdsourced post-publication peer review. So you can search a paper that's published on there and write comments, and lots of discussions happen that way. F1000 Research does it's completely open access, and they do post-publication open peer review. Of course, there's various kinds of preprint servers now, and this is all part, like Plan S and the Open Science framework are all kind of part of the open science movement, right? This is kind of the big umbrella term in which includes sort of all sorts of these types of open access publications, open hardware, open source software, open research methodology, open research data, open resources, et cetera. Open science is really, it's not a very, it's like a really, really big kind of heterogeneous movement, but right now this is kind of what a lot of these, the revolutions that I'm talking about in academic research is kind of coming under this, this label. But its goals are to sort of increase transparency, making research visible, enabling better sharing of materials, making research more accessible and not behind paywalls, and being more inclusive and equitable for science going forward. Philosophers of science have, of course, talked about philosophy of open science. In particular, Sabina Leonelli has written a recent book on open science, and Leonelli. So I'm not going to I have a slide on kind of like what she has concluded about open science, but she kind of argues that the standard approach to open science so far, particularly in its emphasis on object sharing, such as data sets and materials, is not sort of maybe the best way to go, and instead what we should be sharing having open processes rather than open objects. But I will be kind of taking a different track in this paper. Instead, I'll be kind of arguing that open science is only a kind of a partial solution to a much broader problem in the social epistemology of science. So I'm really thinking about scientific publishing and academic publishing in general is a social epistemic problem. And in particular, I'm kind of focusing my attention on academic publications, scientific publications in particular, whose primary audiences is other scientists. And this would be the vast majority of science journals, databases, and preprint servers. Of course, scientists communicate in lots of other ways, like conferences, and they email, they're on Twitter, so I'm kind of setting aside those types of communication, kind of maybe focusing on just the academic publishing or like the scientific journal as a social epistemic object. And I'm also setting aside things like scientific outputs that are meant to interface with the general public, and those I think will probably be governed by a different set of social epistemic norms. So what do I mean that academic publications are a social epistemic object, or what is the social epistemology of scientific publications. So I think we should think about what are the social epistemic functions of scientific publications that are mainly read by the scientific community, whose primary audience is other scientists. And and scientific publications typically, I think, have three main functions. The first is documentation. It's meant to be a record of scientific knowledge. It establishes credit and priority over discoveries. And then third is to facilitate communication and exchange of ideas. And in fact, and I think this is very intuitive about how we go about thinking about scientific publications, but we actually, in fact, ask a lot of scientific journals and articles to do all three things. And this has actually been really well explored by some recent work in the history of science. So there's a great book by Alex Cesar, who's a historian of science at Harvard, this 2018 book called called The Scientific Journal, in which Cesar traces the history and development of the modern scientific journal. And in fact, he argues very, I think convincingly, that the modern scientific journal is largely an invention of the 19th century. It actually has a much recent history than we typically think. For example, like Charles Darwin was really at the edge of that transition from scientists writing mostly books as the vehicle for transmitting scientific ideas into journal articles. Like Darwin was kind of one of the last great scientists to write a book, and the vehicle in which scientific ideas are presented changes like the nature of the activity, like the types of ideas that can be that are the subjects of books, like The Origin of Species, right, versus what can be fit into a journal article, right? They're very, very different types of like intellectual endeavors, right? And you see that transition in the 19th century. The periodicals, however, comprising of natural philosophical news, like the Philosophical Transactions, have a much longer history. But in the 20th and in the 20th century, the scientific journal really kind of takes the shape in which that we see it today. But we kind of, this period between the 19th century into the 20th century, we see, Alex Cesar, right, tells us that we see an emergence of a cohesive single genre, the scientific paper, and also the scientific author, right, as being kind of a new phenomenon. And I think this is a wonderful area in which philosophers of science and historians of science are kind of in contact, that there are historians who are really interested in these topics right now. I think it's like really exciting. One just like quick thing about Cesar, he's also right now working on a book on the history of the Science Citation Index, which has all this really interesting work about bibliometrics and the idea that we can measure a scientist's productivity by the number of citations, and like where did that idea come from? How does it changes the nature of the activity? And I think this is like a great graduate students out there, like this is a great research topic. But let me just read you this quick quote from Cesar. He says, "Not very long ago, the arrangement appeared to many these three epistemic functions that I've identified that comes together, right, seems to be a natural feature of how modern science is supposed to work. But that has now changed. We're in the midst of an intense period of experimentation in genres, formats, and practices of evaluation in science. As the hegemony of the scientific journal comes unbound, we can now ask how this format and genre became such a dominant institution in the first place. How did it ever become possible to suppose that scientific journals could be both permanent archive and breaking news, both a public repository and the exclusive dominion of experts, both a complete record and a painstakingly vetted selection?" So you see the tensions of what we ask for, right, in a scientific journal, and what are the stakes in deciding that this is no longer makes sense, right? So, and I think this is a uniquely HPS project, a HPS problem. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about what philosophers of science can say in response, right, to these kind of this problem that a historian has posed to us, right, about the nature of scientific communication. So why do these three things come together in the scientific journal, right? Where we ask the scientific journal to do these three things, and what would it mean for these three things to come unbound in the 21st century, right? For the new movements in science. So let me say a little bit more about these three social epistemic functions. So documentation, right? So we think of scientific journals as an established record of our by scientific knowledge, and it's commonly held that peer review is required for journals to establish quality control. The reason why it is a record is because the record has been peer reviewed, right? But interestingly, I mean, I can have a whole other hour to talk about this, but there's a really interesting history of peer review that's very recent. The systematic introduction of peer review into scientific journals doesn't happen until the 1960s. For example, the journal Nature doesn't institute formal peer review until 1967, and it's only in the 1980s that the idea that the peer review is a way to vet errors and quality control that comes into it. So these are all historical contingent facts that we take it for granted, right? That these are things that are required for a scientific article. And there has been many recent philosophical critiques of peer review and whether or not these things should stick together, right? Peer review and documentation. Credit and priority, these are, journal articles remain the currency of the realm in academia. We live, scientists and us philosophers, right, live by publish or perish. The credit economy, there's work by Kevin Zollman and Michael Strevens, right, on the priority rule about how the credit economy really is kind of, is an allocation, forces the allocation of resources in science as a way of organizing of science. And finally, there is communication, right? So the scientific journal is also, it's a record, a permanent record, but also it's meant to be breaking news, right? It's meant for also how we communicate results to each other, to publicize results and methods. Scientific journals, scientific papers and journals are meant to promote and encourage open and free exchange of ideas to advance knowledge production in the community. And this might be, are related to Hamiltonian norms, for example. But currently, publishing, right, academic publishing are not really doing very well, right, and doing kind of fulfilling its social epistemic functions, right? There's lots of work on this, and also scientists have been talking a lot about this, about how the for-profit model is exploitative, that there's a lot of limits to paywalls, right, and that traditional publishing process is actually very slow, and this kind of drives people to put their papers up on archives, on the archive, right, so to establish priority. There's also lots of problems with peer review. Carol Lee has written a lot about this, and it's, so the current state of academic publishing fails to fulfill its epistemic functions. The published scientific record is not really a true record of scientific findings. When errors are found, retractions are very difficult to initiate. There's actually, and retracted papers get read a lot still. There's the reproducibility crisis has thrown many of these sort of long problems into sharp relief. There's also lots of problems right now in the idea of a scientific author, like who counts as an author, especially in big collaborations. And scientific authorship disputes are one of the most common areas of scientific misconduct. And there's been some interesting work by philosophers also on this idea that this publish or perish model is actually detrimental to science's epistemic aims, right? It's actually bad for scientists to work this way under this kind of pressure. And of course, does the scientific journal, like the current way that we're publishing, really a good way to communicate our results, right? And it seems like, look, it's slow, it's limited, there's limited access, it's controlled by these big publishing houses, right? That publicly funded research is not always publicly available. So is open science the the solution, right? Open science purports to, hold scientists more accountable because then they have to publish all of their data and pre-register and all those kind of things, right? To sort of solve some of these problems of fidelity, right? The problems of errors in the scientific method, and also these very high-profile instances of fraud. To that sharing data and methods is meant to kind of prevent sort of these kinds of bad cases of bad actors. And this push to open access, right, is supposed to make science more accessible and more freely available, and increasing transparency is meant to be sort of an unalloyed good. Ideas like open peer review is supposed to help increase trust and transparency and prevent misconduct. Is this true, right? Is open science, of course, like I'm running out of time, so I can only just tell you that no, it's not, it's only a partial solution, of course. And I would give you sort of a social epistemic evaluation of what's kind of going on, right? Like what we should think about, I think this is where philosopher of science really has a really large role to play, as scientists themselves are trying to figure this out, is to ask these questions about what do we want out of the future, right? Like for documentation, right? What is worth recording and making available? There's this interesting study where there are these data availability statements that are mandatory for a lot of open access journals. Someone went and asked scientists for their data, and 93% of those scientists said, no, I'm not sharing my data, or just ignored those emails, right? So even though we want those things to be available, they're really actually not, right? But what are we doing when we're asked for those things, right? And what's worth documenting and remembering? There's questions about credit and priority, right? Open science leaves this kind of current credit system in science intact. It's not a challenge to the publish or perish model. And I think if we want to reimagine what science will look like, that we might need a revolution, right, in the credit economy of science. And finally, we should rethink communication, right? What open science perversely incentivizes journal proliferation, but not the quality of content, and it kind of just pushes more papers to be written and more journals, but what we want is better research, right? And how do we actually incentivize that? And what are other avenues for people to communicate their results? And Leonelli has also written about this, about how open science fails to make science more equitable and inclusive. So I just want to close to say that I want philosophers of science to come to the rescue, right, of this problem that scientists are having about what is really to help scientists design better institutions and better systems. And perhaps we ourselves can be reflective and think about what philosophical publications should look like as well. And thank you so much.
Thank you for the great talk. A few things. First of all, I just want to point out, I assume you are, we should make sure you're talking to a whole bunch of scientists working on these questions. People like Bjorn Brems has been doing a lot of work on this kind of stuff, including really good analysis work on these, the fact that high-impact journals actually produce less reliable data.
Yeah.
Also, eLife does gatekeep. The editors do the gatekeeping.
eLife, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention that. So, the editors kind of do a first pass, but then everything else gets put up.
Right. So it turns out it's not actually peer review anymore. It's whatever the editors want.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, what all those other journals did too. And I can tell you for a fact, Nature ignores the peer reviews. The editors also decide. But my question I have is, you said at the beginning you were only going to address the science-to-science communication.
Yes.
But how do we prevent the politicians, the doctors, the non-scientists from accessing our open access preprint peer review? So our preprint servers. Yeah. So bioRxiv is fine. My lab can do the peer review on other people in my field. that's fine. There's no problem with just putting everything on bioarchive. If they put crap out, we'll stop trusting them.
Yeah.
But how do we prevent the politician from taking an ivermectin paper off of medRxiv?
Yeah. So I think this is like, so I think fundamentally there's a misunderstanding, and I hope like science communicators and like science education could help with this, is that like there are certain, like the archive and some of these journals are meant to be read by other experts who have the relevant expertise to actually understand what's going on, and people who are non-experts who are reading this stuff can be very easily misled or just kind of pick whatever they want from the mass. And I think better science communication and better science education about how to read science, right, is kind of needed. But of course, like, there are going to be powerful actors out there who's going to try to use science for their own means. But I think that's a much bigger question, right? I feel like scientists themselves are just try to write a paper to communicate results, aren't really thinking like, is there some politician out there who's going to like misconstrue this, right? But thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Hi.
Oh.
I have a similar question, so maybe this is unfair to keep pressing you on this point, given what you said about science-to-science communication, but these publications appear regularly in things like medical journals. So, for example, in the third chapter of Sergio Sismondo's Ghost Managed Medicine book is an entire case study of publication planning in medical journals. And this is big business. This is huge business. He went to various conferences of the professional groups of the publication planners, which includes the planning of the studies for new blockbuster drugs, the planning of where those studies would get published, and along the way, towards the end, planning who would write those papers, having been written by the publication planners themselves. And there's been a sort of pushback to this and trying to make sure that those people have to be cited as authors so that people know about So I just wonder if it's right to read things like medical journals, which seem like they're science papers for scientists, as that, or whether we should read them as marketing.
So I think the medical journals in particular are they're the ones who are actually most worried about these problems and they're the ones who push the most for open access, for accountability statement, like contributor statements from their authors, and for their authors to disclose conflicts of interest and all sorts of things, right? So of course, there's only so much the journals can do. People can try to get around that, and but I do think this is a real problem with people who are trying to game the system to get sort of their version of science out, and it's difficult. And I think open science, a lot of the proponents of open science and some of these new editorial policies, new journal models, new requirements, guidelines, are exactly trying to the police, right, figure out like how do we not have these kinds of bad cases of scientific of people letting things in, and that's going to be something that's like really, I'm not sure what can be done, but I think this is like a really interesting problem that philosophers should have something to help scientists with. Yeah.
It's more than 5 people in the queue, so you're going to have a very busy coffee break. But
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy to talk. Yeah. Thank you.